He bought me, but he never touched me. That was the first thing I realized standing in front of a mirror I knew I could never afford. In a room that didn't belong to me, wearing clothes I didn't remember choosing, inside a house that felt too quiet for someone as powerful as him to live in. My name is Emily Carter, and 3 nights ago my mother sold me like I was something she could trade away, like I was the last piece of value she had left to offer. And I thought I understood what that meant. I thought I knew exactly what kind of life was waiting for me on the other side of that deal, but I was wrong, and somehow that made everything worse. The mirror stretched from the polished hardwood floor all the way to the high ceiling, framed in dark wood that smelled faintly like cedar. The kind of detail you only notice when you don't belong somewhere, when every breath feels borrowed, when every second feels like you're waiting for something to happen. I studied my reflection like I was trying to recognize a stranger, like if I looked long enough I might see the version of me from before that night, before the knock on our door, before my mother refused to meet my eyes, before the man in the tailored black coat stepped into our apartment like he owned the air we were breathing. My hands lifted slowly, almost like they didn't belong to me, brushing over the soft fabric of the dress they had given me. Silk maybe, something expensive enough that I was afraid to wrinkle it, afraid to exist too loudly in it, and that fear settled deep in my chest, heavy and unfamiliar, because it wasn't just about the dress, it was about everything. Nothing here made sense. The bed behind me was untouched, perfectly made like it was part of a showroom, the kind of bed you see in magazines where people don't actually sleep, where everything is staged to look perfect, controlled, untouched, just like the rest of this place, just like him. Alexander Volkov. I didn't know his name when I first saw him, but I knew what he was the second the room went quiet around him. The second my mother's voice changed, softer, smaller, like she had already decided something for both of us. I remember the way he looked at me, not the way men usually do, not with curiosity or judgment or anything I knew how to read, but like he was searching for something, like he already knew the answer and just needed to confirm it. That look followed me here, lingered in the corners of this room, in the silence that pressed against my ears, in the locked door behind me that no one had tried to open since I arrived. That was the part one couldn't understand. I walked to the door slowly, my bare feet barely making a sound against the floor, and I reached for the handle again even though I already knew what would happen, even though I had tested it twice before. The cold metal steady under my fingers as I turned it gently, quietly, like I was afraid the house itself might hear me. Locked. Not slammed shut. Not guarded by someone standing outside. Just locked. Like I was being kept safe instead of kept in. I let go slowly, my hand falling back to my side as my reflection caught my eye again, and for a second, just 1 second, I thought about what he hadn't done. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't made demands. He hadn't even come near me after that first night. And somehow that silence, that distance, that control scared me more than anything else could have. Because if he didn't want something from me, then why was I here at all? I did not sleep that night or the night after or the one before that, not really, not the kind of sleep that lets your mind rest, because every time I closed my eyes I saw my mother standing in that dim kitchen light, her arms crossed like she was protecting herself from me instead of the men at the door, and I kept waiting for the part where she would stop it, where she would say it was a mistake, where she would remember I was her daughter, but that part never came, it just replayed over and over like something my brain refused to accept. I sat on the edge of the bed as the hours stretched into something shapeless, watching the faint glow of morning slip through the tall windows, turning the room from shadow into something softer, almost peaceful, if you ignored the truth behind it. And for a second I let myself pretend this was just a hotel, just a strange place I ended up in by accident, just one more bad night that would pass. A soft knock broke that illusion. It was quiet, careful, like whoever stood on the other side already knew I was fragile in ways they could not see. I froze, my breath catching before I could stop it, my body reacting before my mind caught up, because no one had come to this door since I arrived, no footsteps, no voices, nothing but silence and the distant hum of a house too large for one person to fill. The handle did not turn this time, but a voice followed, low and steady. Miss Carter. The way they said my name made it sound unfamiliar, like it belonged to someone else, someone who had control over their life, someone who had not been handed over like a signed document. Breakfast is ready whenever you are. I did not answer right away, my eyes fixed on the door like it might open anyway, like this was some kind of test I did not understand, but after a few seconds the footsteps retreated, quiet again, leaving me alone with the sound of my own heartbeat. Breakfast. The word felt wrong in my head, too normal, too ordinary for a situation that had nothing normal about it, And yet my stomach tightened at the thought, reminding me I had not eaten since that night, since everything changed. I stood slowly, my legs unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with uncertainty, and I moved toward the door again, my hand hovering over the handle before I forced myself to turn it. This time it opened. Not wide, not inviting, just enough to remind me that whatever rules existed here were not random, they were controlled, deliberate, chosen. The hallway beyond stretched long and quiet, lined with dark wood and soft lighting that made everything feel distant, like I was walking through a place that did not expect me to stay. I stepped out carefully, my senses sharp, listening for anything, anyone, but the house remained still, almost respectful in its silence. At the end of the hall, a woman waited, dressed in simple black, her posture straight, her expression neutral in a way that felt practiced. She nodded once when she saw me, not warm, not cold, just acknowledging. "This way," she said softly, turning without waiting to see if I would follow, and for a moment I considered not moving at all, considered turning back, closing the door, pretending none of this existed, but that was not an option anymore, not after the choice had already been made for me. I followed. Each step felt heavier than the last, the sound of my own movement echoing in my ears as we moved through the house, down a curved staircase that opened into a space so wide it made my chest tighten, sunlight pouring in through tall windows, reflecting off polished surfaces that made everything look too clean, too perfect, like a life no one actually lived. The dining room sat at the center, a long table set for two. Not 20, not a crowd, just two plates placed across from each other like this was something personal, something intentional. And at the far end, standing beside the chair like he had been waiting the entire time, was him. Alexander Volkov did not move when I entered, did not step forward, did not speak right away. He just watched, those steady eyes locking onto mine with that same unreadable intensity that made it impossible to look away and impossible to understand. I stopped a few feet from the table, every instinct telling me to run even though I knew there was nowhere to go, and the silence stretched between us until it felt like something alive. Then he spoke, his voice calm, controlled like he had all the time in the world. "You should eat." Not an order. Not a demand. Just a statement. And somehow that made it harder to breathe. I did not move right away, even though every part of me understood that standing there in silence was not going to change anything, because the way he said it, calm and simple, without pressure, without expectation, made the choice feel like it was mine when I knew it was not, and that illusion unsettled me more than if he had just ordered me to sit down. My eyes dropped to the table for a second, taking in details I did not want to notice, the placement of the silverware, the glass already filled with water, the plate in front of the empty chair across from him. Like this had been planned long before I ever stepped into this house, like I had always been expected to be here. I forced myself to take a step forward, then another, each movement slow and measured, as if moving too fast might trigger something I could not see, and when I reached the chair I hesitated again, my fingers brushing lightly against the backrest before I pulled it out and sat down, keeping my posture stiff, controlled, like I could somehow hold onto a piece of myself by not relaxing into any part of this. He did not sit until I did. That was the first thing I noticed. It was subtle, easy to miss, but it was there, a pause, a deliberate choice, like he was following a rule I did not understand. When he finally took his seat, the distance between us felt both too small and too large at the same time, close enough that I could hear the quiet sound of his breathing, far enough that I could pretend there was still space between his world and mine. No one else entered the room. No servants hovered nearby. No guard stood watch. Just the two of us in a silence that stretched longer than it should have. I picked up the fork because I did not know what else to do, because my hands needed something to hold on to, something that felt normal, even if nothing about this was normal, and I forced myself to take a bite even though I could barely taste it, my senses dulled by the weight of his presence across from me. He watched me, not constantly, not in a way that felt invasive, but enough that I was aware of it, aware of him noticing everything without making it obvious, like he was collecting information without asking for it. "You have not asked any questions," he said after a while, his voice breaking through the quiet in a way that made my chest tighten, because I had questions, too many, but none of them felt safe to say out loud. I swallowed slowly, setting the fork down with more care than necessary as I met his gaze for the first time since sitting down, forcing myself not to look away even though it felt like stepping into something deeper than I could handle. Would it matter if I did? My voice came out steadier than I expected, but I could feel the tension behind it, the edge of something that had been building since that night, something I could not keep buried forever. His expression did not change, not in any obvious way, but there was a shift, something subtle in his eyes, like he had been waiting for that response, like this was part of something he had already anticipated. Yes, he said simply, and that single word made my stomach twist, because it was not dismissive, not indifferent, it was honest in a way I did not expect. I leaned back slightly, crossing my arms without thinking, a small barrier between us that probably meant nothing to him but meant everything to me. Then why am I here? The question left my mouth before I could stop it, sharp and direct, cutting through whatever fragile balance had been holding the moment together, and for a second I thought I saw something flicker in his expression, something that looked almost like hesitation, but it was gone so quickly I could not be sure it had been there at all. He did not answer right away. Instead, he reached for his glass, taking a slow sip as if time moved differently for him, as if he controlled even the pace of this conversation, and when he set it down, his eyes returned to mine with that same steady focus that made it impossible to look anywhere else. Because leaving would be worse for you. The words landed heavier than I expected, not because of what they said, but because of how calmly he said them, like it was a fact, like it was something already decided, and something in my chest tightened at the implication, because if staying here was the safer option, then I had no idea what I had been taken away from, or why he believed I needed protection at all. Worse than this. The words slipped out before I could stop them, quieter than I intended but sharp enough to hang in the air between us, and the moment they did, I wished I could take them back, not because I was afraid of his reaction, but because I was afraid of the answer. He did not respond immediately. That was becoming a pattern. He let silence do the work first, let it stretch and settle, let it press against me until I felt the need to fill it, until I felt exposed just for asking. I held his gaze anyway, even as my fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the table, grounding myself in something solid while everything else felt uncertain. You think this is control, he said finally, his voice even measured, like he was choosing each word with care, but it is containment. The distinction did not make me feel better. If anything, it made my chest tighten because containment meant something was being kept in, or something was being kept out, and I did not know which one I was. I shook my head slightly, a small instinctive reaction, my thoughts racing faster than I could organize them. You are going to have to explain that, I said, my voice steadier now because confusion was easier to handle than fear, easier than the quiet certainty that I was missing something important. His eyes did not leave mine, not for a second, and there was something different there now, something deeper, not softer but less distant, like he was deciding how much to reveal and how much to keep for himself. Your mother made a choice, he said, and the way he said it made my stomach drop, because it sounded like there was more to that choice than I had understood, more than the simple transaction I had witnessed. Do not defend her? I cut in quickly, the words sharper than I intended, the memory of that night rising too fast, too raw, because whatever explanation he had, whatever justification existed, it did not change the fact that she had looked at me and said nothing while everything was taken away. Something flickered in his expression again, brief but unmistakable this time. Not anger, not irritation, something closer to recognition, like he understood that reaction in a way that went beyond this moment. I am not defending her, he said, calm as ever, and somehow that made it easier to listen, easier to stay in this conversation instead of shutting down completely. I am telling you that what you saw was not the whole of it. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air heavier, like the walls themselves were listening, and I leaned back slightly, creating space that did not actually exist, my mind trying to piece together something that made sense out of what he was saying. Then what did I not see? I asked, quieter now, not because I was less angry, but because something else had taken its place, something colder, more focused, the kind of feeling you get right before you understand something you were not supposed to know. He did not answer right away, and this time the silence felt different, less like a test and more like a line he was deciding whether to cross. His hand rested lightly on the table, fingers still, controlled, like every part of him operated with intention, and when he finally spoke, his voice dropped just enough that it felt more personal, more direct. You did not see who was waiting for you after I left. The words settled into me slowly, each one carrying weight I did not fully understand yet, but enough to shift something inside my chest, enough to make the room tilt just slightly as my mind reached for explanations that did not fit, possibilities that felt too far from what I had believed. No one was waiting for me, I said automatically, because that was the truth as I knew it, because my world had been small, contained in a way that felt ordinary, not dangerous. But even as I said it, doubt crept in, subtle and unwelcome, because he did not look like someone who guessed, he looked like someone who knew. "That is what you were meant to believe," he replied, and this time there was no pause, no hesitation, just certainty, quiet and unshakable, and something in my chest tightened again, not from fear this time, but from the realization that whatever was happening here, whatever I had been pulled into, it had started long before that night, long before my mother signed anything, and for the first time since I arrived, I was not just wondering what he wanted from me, I was wondering what he had saved me from. The words did not leave me, they stayed there, circling in my head like something unfinished, something that refused to settle, because if what he was saying was true, then everything I thought I understood about my life before this moment was incomplete, and I did not know which part of it was real anymore. I stared at him longer than I should have, searching his face for something that would tell me this was manipulation, that this was just another layer of control designed to keep me here. But there was nothing obvious to grab onto, no shift in tone, no crack in his composure, just that same quiet certainty that made it impossible to dismiss him completely. "Then explain it," I said, my voice lower now, not as sharp but more deliberate, because if there was something I did not see, I needed to understand it even if I did not want to. His gaze held mine for a moment longer before it shifted, not away in avoidance, but slightly to the side, like he was considering something beyond the room, beyond me, something tied to decisions that had already been made. "Not yet," he replied, and that answer hit harder than I expected, not because it was aggressive, but because it was controlled like everything else about him, like he had already decided the timing of every answer I would get. Frustration rose quickly, sharp and immediate, cutting through the confusion that had started to settle in, and I leaned forward slightly, my hands pressing against the edge of the table. "You do not get to decide that," I said, the words coming faster now, fueled by something I had been holding back since the moment I arrived. "You do not get to bring me here, tell me I am safer, and then refuse to tell me why." The silence that followed was not empty this time. It was charged, heavier, like something had shifted between us, something that could not be taken back. He did not interrupt me, did not shut me down, he just listened, and that alone was enough to throw me off balance because I had expected resistance, expected him to assert control in a way I could push against, but instead he let me speak, let the words hang there unchallenged. "You are right," he said after a moment, and the simplicity of that response made my breath catch, because it was not what I expected, not what I was prepared for. I blinked, thrown by the agreement, my thoughts stalling for a second as I tried to process it. "What?" The word slipped out before I could stop it. He leaned back slightly in his chair, his posture still composed, still controlled, but there was something different in the space between us now, something less rigid, less defined. "You are right," he repeated, his voice steady. "I do not get to decide what you deserve to know." The admission settled into me slowly, unexpected and unsettling in a completely different way, because it shifted the dynamic just enough to make me question everything again, not just him but myself, my assumptions, my reactions. "Then tell me," I said, quieter now, the edge gone from my voice but the need still there, stronger than before, because now it felt like there was something real beneath all of this, something that mattered. He studied me for a long moment, not evaluating, not judging, just watching, like he was measuring something that had nothing to do with fear or obedience, something deeper, something I did not fully understand. "There are people," he began slowly, each word deliberate, "who believed your mother could not pay what she owed." My stomach tightened again, the mention of her pulling everything back to that night, to the moment everything changed. And they would not have accepted anything less than full repayment. I swallowed, my hands tightening slightly against the table as the implication started to form, still incomplete, still uncertain. "So she gave them me," I said, the conclusion automatic, bitter, familiar, because that was the version I knew, the version I had accepted. He shook his head once, a small, controlled movement that stopped my thoughts midstream. "No," he said quietly, and the certainty in that single word made something shift again, something deeper this time, something harder to ignore. "She gave you to me before they could take you themselves." The room felt still again, but not the same kind of stillness as before, this one heavier, more final, like a door had just opened onto something I was not ready to see. And for the first time since this began, the question in my mind was no longer what he wanted from me, but what would have happened if he had not been there at all. For a moment I could not breathe, not because of what he said, but because of how easily it fit into something I had refused to question, something I had accepted too quickly because it hurt less that way, because it was easier to believe I had been abandoned than to consider that something worse had been waiting just outside the edges of my understanding. My fingers loosened slightly against the table, the tension shifting into something colder, more focused, and I looked at him differently now, not as the man who had taken me, but as the man who had arrived first. "You expect me to believe that?" I asked, my voice quieter than before, not as sharp but more careful, because if this was true, then every assumption I had made about him was wrong, and I did not know what to do with that. He did not react to the doubt in my tone, did not push back, did not try to convince me. He just held my gaze with that same steady calm that made it impossible to read him completely. "I do not expect anything," he said, and there was something in that answer that felt honest in a way I could not dismiss, something that did not try to control my reaction, only present what he believed to be fact. I shook my head slightly, trying to piece together something that made sense, something that aligned with the life I remembered, because there had been no signs, no warnings, nothing that suggested I was in danger beyond the quiet struggle of unpaid bills, and a mother who had grown more distant with each passing month. "There was no one else," I said, more to myself than to him, my voice softer now, uncertain in a way that unsettled me. "There was nothing." His expression did not change, but there was a shift in his posture, subtle but deliberate, like he was preparing to show me something instead of just telling me. "That is the point," he replied, and those words settled into me with a weight I could not ignore, because they suggested something hidden, something carefully kept out of my view. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket then, slow and controlled, his movements never rushed, never unpredictable, and for a brief second my body tensed. Instinctively before my mind caught up, before I realized there was no urgency in what he was doing. He placed something on the table between us, sliding it forward just enough that it rested within my reach, but not touching me, not forcing the moment. It was a small object, simple at first glance, a photograph worn slightly at the edges, like it had been handled more than once, and I hesitated before picking it up, my fingers hovering over it like I was afraid of what I might see. When I finally did, the world around me seemed to narrow, the edges of the room fading as my focus locked onto the image in my hand. It was me. Or at least it was a version of me I did not remember. I was standing outside what looked like a grocery store, a bag in my hand, my hair pulled back in a way I had worn it countless times, nothing unusual, nothing out of place, except for one detail that made my chest tighten instantly. In the reflection of the glass behind me, barely visible unless you were looking for it, was a figure standing just a few feet away, watching. The angle was wrong for it to be coincidence. The positioning was too deliberate. Someone had been there, close enough to follow, far enough not to be noticed. My grip on the photograph tightened without me realizing it, my breath catching as my mind tried to reject what I was seeing, tried to explain it away as something harmless, something ordinary, but the longer I looked, the harder that became. "This was taken 3 weeks ago," he said quietly, and his voice pulled me back just enough to hear him without looking away from the image. "You were not alone." The words settled into me slowly, each one pulling at something deeper, something that had been there without my awareness, something that made the past feel less stable than it had just moments ago. I lowered the photograph slightly, my eyes lifting to meet his again, searching for something, anything that would ground me in reality, but all I found was that same unwavering certainty. "How many?" I asked, the question leaving my mouth before I could stop it, because if there had been one, there could have been more, and that possibility made everything feel suddenly fragile. He did not hesitate this time. "Enough," he said, and that single word was heavier than any number could have been, because it told me this was not an accident, not a one-time coincidence, but something ongoing, something intentional, something I had never seen until now. And as I sat there holding proof of a truth I had never questioned, I realized the most terrifying part was not that someone had been watching me, it was that I had never noticed at all. The photograph felt heavier the longer I held it, like the weight was not in the paper but in what it represented, in what it proved without asking for my permission to believe it, and I found myself staring at that reflection again, tracing the outline of the figure with my eyes as if looking long enough might make it disappear, might turn it into a trick of light or coincidence, but it stayed there, unmoving, undeniable. I set it down slowly, more carefully than I intended, like it might break if I handled it wrong. even though I knew that was not possible. And when I looked back up at him, something inside me had shifted, something subtle but permanent, like a line I could not cross back over. Why? The question came out quieter than anything I had said before, not defensive, not sharp, just honest, because if someone had been watching me, if there had been more than one, then there had to be a reason, something about me that I did not understand, something I had never questioned. He did not answer right away, but this time the silence did not feel like avoidance, it felt like wait, like the kind of pause that comes before something that cannot be taken back. You were connected, he said finally, and the phrasing made my brow tighten slightly, confusion rising again, because I had never been connected to anything important, anything powerful, anything worth watching. To what? I asked, leaning forward just enough that I could feel the shift in my own posture, the shift from resistance to something closer to needing answers. His gaze did not waver, but there was something different there again, something more focused, more precise, like he was no longer measuring what I could handle, but deciding what I needed to know. Your father, he said, and the word landed wrong immediately, not because I did not understand it, but because it did not fit into my life the way it should have, because my father had always been an absence, a name that was never spoken, a space that was never filled. I do not have a father, I replied automatically, the response immediate, instinctive, shaped by years of not asking, not pushing, not needing something that had never been there. He watched me for a moment, not correcting me, not arguing, just observing the reaction like it told him everything he needed to know. You had one, he said, his voice steady, not forceful, just certain, and that certainty made my chest tighten again, because it suggested something I had never considered, something that had been deliberately kept from me. I shook my head slightly, trying to push back against it, against the idea that there was a part of my life I had never been told, something that could connect me to whatever this was, whatever had been watching me without my knowledge. Then where is he? The question felt different, heavier, because it carried something I did not want to admit, something close to curiosity, close to a need I had never allowed myself to feel. He did not look away when he answered, did not soften the words or change the tone, he just said them as they were. Gone. The simplicity of it should have made it easier, should have closed the door on whatever this was, but it did the opposite because it left too much unsaid, too many possibilities, too many questions that suddenly mattered in a way they never had before. That does not explain anything, I said, the frustration returning, but it was different now, less about him and more about the gap in my own understanding, the pieces that did not fit together anymore. He nodded once, a small acknowledgement, like he expected that reaction, like he had already moved ahead of it. He was not ordinary, he continued, and those words changed something again, because ordinary was the only life I had ever known, the only version of reality I had accepted without question. People paid attention to him, and when he was gone, that attention did not disappear. I felt my hands tighten again, the implication settling in deeper this time, connecting to the photograph, to the figure in the reflection, to the feeling that something had been there without me knowing. So they watched me instead, I said, the conclusion forming slowly but clearly now, and saying it out loud made it real in a way that nothing else had. He did not correct me. He did not soften it. He just held my gaze and let the truth exist between us without interruption. And in that moment, sitting across from a man I had believed was my captor, I realized something that shifted everything I thought I knew. I had not been taken because I was worthless. I had been taken because I was not. The realization did not feel empowering the way it should have. It did not feel like strength or importance. It felt like exposure, like standing in the middle of a room with walls made of glass, like everything I thought was private had never really been mine to keep, and I could feel that truth settling into my chest, heavy and difficult to breathe around. I looked down at the photograph again, my thumb brushing lightly against the edge without thinking, tracing something that had already changed meaning. And for the first time I saw it differently, not as a random moment captured, but as evidence of something ongoing, something deliberate. Why did no one tell me? The question came out softer than I expected, not directed at him entirely, but at everything, at the years I had lived without knowing, at the quiet life that now felt like a carefully constructed illusion. He did not rush to answer, but when he did, his voice carried something new, not softer but more grounded, like he understood the weight behind the question. Because knowing would not have protected you, he said, and that answer settled into me with an uncomfortable clarity, because it made sense in a way I did not want it to, because it suggested that ignorance had been intentional, not careless. I shook my head slightly, my thoughts moving too fast, trying to connect pieces that had never been meant to fit together in my understanding. So everyone just decided for me, I said, a faint edge returning to my voice, not anger exactly but something close, something that needed somewhere to go. His gaze remained steady, unshaken by the shift in my tone. They decided what kept you alive, he replied, and that phrasing stopped me for a second, not because it was dramatic, but because it was simple, direct, impossible to ignore. Alive. The word echoed differently now, not as something automatic, but as something that had been at risk without me realizing it. I leaned back slightly, my arms crossing again, not as a barrier this time, but as something to hold on to, something that kept me steady as the ground beneath me shifted. And now? I asked, my eyes lifting to meet his again, searching for something I could hold on to, some kind of direction in all of this. Now I just stay here? He did not answer immediately, but there was a change in the way he looked at me, something more direct, more intentional, like the conversation had reached a point he had been moving toward from the beginning. Now you decide, he said, and the words felt out of place at first, almost contradictory to everything else that had happened, because choice had not been part of any of this until now. I blinked, caught off guard, my thoughts stalling for a second as I tried to process it. That does not make sense, I said, the confusion clear in my voice, because nothing about this situation had suggested I had any control over what happened next. He leaned forward slightly, just enough to close the distance by a fraction, not enough to feel threatening but enough to feel intentional, like this part mattered more than anything he had said before. You can stay here, he said, his voice calm but firm, where I can control what reaches you and what does not. Control. The word landed differently now, less like ownership and more like structure, like something defined rather than imposed. Or you can leave, he continued, and that option hit harder than I expected because it sounded like freedom, but it did not feel like it, not with everything I had just learned. My chest tightened slightly, the idea of stepping back into a world that was no longer what I thought it was, sending a quiet unease through me. And if I leave? I asked, my voice steady even as the question carried more weight than anything I had said so far. He held my gaze without hesitation, without softening the truth or adjusting it to make it easier to accept. Then you will not be invisible anymore. The words settled into the space between us, quiet but final, and for the first time since this began, I understood something clearly. This was not about being owned, it was about being seen, and I did not know which one was more dangerous. His words did not leave the room when he said them, they stayed with me, settling into something deeper than sound, something that followed me even after I stood up from that table, even after I walked back through the long hallway with the same quiet steps, even after the door to my room closed behind me with that soft, controlled finality that now felt less like a lock and more like a boundary I did not fully understand. Not invisible anymore. The phrase echoed in my head as I moved slowly across the room, my fingers brushing against the edge of the dresser, the back of the chair, small grounding touches that reminded me I was still here, still real, even as everything else shifted around me. I stopped in front of the window, the glass cool beneath my fingertips as I looked out over a landscape that felt too still, too distant, the kind of place where nothing happened unless someone allowed it to. That was the part one could not shake. Nothing here happened by accident. Not the way I was brought here. Not the way he spoke. Not even the way he gave me a choice. It was all controlled, measured, intentional. And yet, for the first time since this began, I felt something unexpected rising beneath the fear and confusion, something quieter but just as persistent. I felt seen. The thought came uninvited and I almost rejected it immediately, because it did not fit with anything I had believed about him, about this situation, but the more I tried to push it away, the more it stayed. He had noticed things. Not just the obvious, not just what anyone could see, but the details, the patterns, the parts of my life I had not even considered important. The photograph. The way he knew about my father. The fact that he had arrived before anyone else could. That was not random. That was attention. And attention meant intention. I turned away from the window slowly, my gaze drifting back to the photograph I had set on the small table near the bed, and I picked it up again without thinking, studying it with a different kind of focus now, not just fear but understanding. Someone had been watching me. More than one. For weeks, maybe longer. And I had never noticed. The realization settled into me again, but this time it carried something else with it, something sharper. If they had been watching me then, what was stopping them from watching me now? My grip on the photograph tightened slightly, my breath catching as the thought fully formed, because leaving this house did not mean freedom, not really, it meant exposure. It meant stepping back into a world that was no longer hidden from me, no longer simple. I moved quickly then, faster than I had since arriving, crossing the room to the door and pulling it open without hesitation. The hallway beyond just as quiet as before, just as still, but it felt different now, like I was moving with purpose instead of uncertainty. I did not stop until I reached the staircase, my steps quicker, my mind focused on one thing, one question that mattered more than anything else. I found him in the same place, standing near the far end of the room, as if he had not moved at all, as if time worked differently for him, and when his eyes lifted to meet mine, there was no surprise there, no reaction to my sudden return, just that same steady awareness, like he had expected this. I stopped a few feet away, my chest rising and falling faster than I wanted it to. But I did not slow down, did not soften the urgency that had taken hold of me. If I stay, I said, the words coming out clearly despite everything, then what happens to them? He did not ask who I meant. He did not need to. His gaze held mine for a second longer before he answered, his voice calm, controlled, but carrying a weight that made everything else fall quiet around it. They stop looking for you. The answer settled into me instantly, not because it was complicated, but because it was not, because it was simple in a way that made the choice in front of me clearer than anything else had. Stay and disappear again. Leave and become visible. I felt the shift happen then. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet adjustment inside my chest. Like something had aligned into place without asking for permission. I looked at him differently now, not as someone who had taken something from me, but as someone standing between me and something I had never seen coming. And for the first time since this began, I was not just reacting to what was happening to me. I was deciding what I was willing to face. I did not answer him right away, not because I did not understand what he was saying, but because for the first time since all of this began, the weight of the decision felt like it belonged to me, and that made it harder, not easier, because it meant whatever came next would not just happen to me, it would be something I allowed. I held his gaze, searching for something that might make it simpler, something that would tell me what the right choice was, but there was nothing there except that same steady control, that same refusal to decide for me again. My fingers curled slightly at my sides, the tension shifting into something sharper, more focused, and I took a slow breath before speaking. You said they stop looking if I stay. I began, my voice steady even as my thoughts moved quickly beneath it, but that does not mean they go away. It was not a question. It was a realization, one that settled into place the moment I said it out loud. He did not correct me. He did not soften it. He just gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. No, he said, and that single word carried more truth than anything else he had told me so far, because it confirmed what I already understood. This was not something that ended. It was something that followed. I took a step closer without realizing it, closing the distance between us just slightly, not out of trust but out of necessity, because if this was my reality now, then I needed to understand it. Completely. Then staying here does not solve anything, I said, my eyes locked on his, pushing past the fear that had been holding me back since the beginning. It just hides me. The words felt clearer the moment they left my mouth, like something had finally aligned inside my head, something that had been building since that first moment in front of the mirror. His expression did not change, but there was a shift in the air between us, something subtle, like he had been waiting for me to reach this point on my own. Yes, he said simply, and the lack of resistance in his answer made my chest tighten in a different way, because it meant he was not trying to trap me here, not trying to convince me of something that was not true. He was letting me see it for what it was. I let out a slow breath, my mind moving through everything he had told me, everything I had seen, everything I had felt since I arrived, and for the first time, it all connected into something that made sense, even if I did not like it. I looked past him for a second, my gaze drifting toward the large windows, the stillness outside, the controlled world he lived in, and then back to him again, grounding myself in the reality of this moment. If I leave, I said slowly, choosing each word with care, then I am not just running anymore. He did not respond immediately, but his attention sharpened, just enough that I could feel it, just enough that I knew he understood exactly what I meant. I swallowed, the next part harder to say, not because I was unsure, but because saying it made it real. I am stepping into something I do not understand. The truth of it settled heavily between us, but it did not feel overwhelming the way it had before. It felt defined, like a path I could see even if I did not know where it ended. He studied me for a moment longer, his eyes steady, searching, and then he spoke, his voice lower now, more deliberate than before. And you would not be alone in that. The words caught me off guard, not because of what they said but because of what they implied, because for the first time there was something in his tone that sounded less like control and more like presence. I frowned slightly, trying to understand, trying to place where that fit into everything else. What does that mean? I asked, my voice quieter now, more cautious, because this felt different from everything that had come before. He did not look away. He did not hesitate. It means, he said, each word measured, each one carrying weight, that if you choose to leave, you do not leave without protection. The room felt still again, but not in the same way as before. This time it felt like something had shifted forward, like the line between us had moved, not erased but changed. I held his gaze, the meaning settling into me slowly, because protection was not the same as ownership. It was not the same as control. It was something else entirely, something I had not expected to hear from him. And in that moment I realized the decision in front of me was no longer just about staying or leaving. It was about whether I was willing to trust the one person who had seen everything before I ever knew to look. Trust was not something I had planned to consider, not here, not with him, not after everything that had led me to this moment. And yet the word settled into my thoughts like it had been waiting there all along, quiet and persistent, refusing to be ignored. I held his gaze, searching for something that would make this easier, something that would confirm this was just another layer of control, another version of the same situation I had been thrown into, but there was nothing there except that same steady presence, that same refusal to force an answer out of me. My fingers tightened slightly at my sides before I let out a slow breath, the tension in my chest shifting into something more focused, more deliberate. Protection comes with a cost, I said, my voice calm but firm, because nothing in my life had ever been given freely, not without something expected in return, and I needed to understand where that line was before I stepped anywhere near it. He did not react immediately, but there was a slight tilt of his head, a subtle acknowledgement that the question mattered, that I was not wrong to ask it. Everything does, he replied, and the honesty in that answer made something in my chest tighten, not from fear this time, but from the weight of it, because it meant he was not pretending otherwise, not offering something unreal just to secure my trust. I nodded once, slowly, absorbing that, letting it settle into place before I spoke again. Then what is yours? The question came out steady, direct, because if this was going to be my decision, then I needed to see it clearly, not through assumptions, not through fear, but through truth. He watched me for a long moment, longer than before, and this time the silence felt different. Not heavy, not pressuring, but deliberate, like he was choosing how much to give and how much to hold back. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, but no less certain. You stay alive, he said, and the simplicity of it caught me off guard because it was not what I expected, not a demand, not a condition I could measure or negotiate, just a statement that felt both too small and too significant at the same time. I frowned slightly, confusion flickering through me before I could stop it. That is not a cost, I said, the words leaving my mouth automatically, because it sounded like an outcome, not a transaction, not something that balanced the scale between us. He did not argue, did not correct me, he just held my gaze, letting the meaning settle without forcing it into something I could reject. It is the only one that matters, he replied, and something in the way he said it made my breath catch, not because of the words themselves, but because of what sat behind them, something unspoken, something that reached beyond control and into something far more complicated. I looked away for a moment, my gaze drifting toward the floor as I tried to process it, tried to place where that fit into everything else, because if that was truly all he wanted, then this was not what I had thought it was from the beginning, not what I had prepared myself to face. My mind moved quickly, pulling together everything he had shown me, everything he had said, the photograph, the truth about my father, the people watching from a distance, and one thought rose above the rest, clear and undeniable. You could have told me to stay, I said slowly, my eyes lifting back to his, studying him in a way I had not allowed myself to before. You could have made this simple. His expression did not change, but there was something in his gaze now, something sharper, more direct, like this was the part that mattered most. And you would have left. he said, not as a question, not as a challenge, but as a certainty, and the truth of it landed instantly because he was right, because if this had felt like a cage, I would have fought it without hesitation, without understanding what I was walking into. I let out a quiet breath, the tension in my shoulders easing just slightly as the realization settled into place, because for the first time, I could see the shape of what this was, not ownership, not control, but something far more intentional. I took a small step forward, closing the distance between us just enough that the space felt different, less like a barrier and more like a line I was choosing to cross. Then I am not staying because you want me to, I said, my voice steady, grounded in something I had not felt since this began. I am staying because I understand what happens if I do not. He did not move, did not interrupt, he just watched, that same quiet intensity fixed on me as I made the decision fully, not out of fear, not out of pressure, but out of clarity. And if I leave, I added, my voice softer now but no less certain, I leave with you. The words settled between us, quiet but final. And for the first time since I stepped into this world, the choice did not feel like something that had been taken from me. It felt like something I had taken back. The moment the words left my mouth, the air between us changed, not dramatically, not in a way anyone else would notice, but I felt it, subtle and undeniable, like something had shifted into alignment, like a decision had finally been made that neither of us needed to question anymore. He did not respond right away, but this time the silence felt different. Not heavy, not uncertain, but settled, like it had found its place. His eyes held mine, steady and unreadable as always, but there was something beneath that stillness now, something quieter, something that had not been there before, or maybe something I had not been able to see until now. I did not look away. I did not step back. For the first time since this began, I stood there without hesitation, without the instinct to retreat or protect myself from what he might do next. Because I understood something I had not understood before. This was not about what he could take from me. It was about what he had already refused to. Then we do not wait, I said, my voice calm, grounded in something steady, because if I had made the decision, then I was not going to stand still and let it lose its weight. He watched me for a second longer before he moved, a small shift forward, controlled and precise like everything he did. But this time it did not feel distant, it felt intentional in a different way, like he was stepping into the same space I had just chosen. No, he agreed, and the simplicity of that response carried more certainty than anything else he could have said. He turned slightly then, his attention shifting just enough that I followed it, my gaze moving toward the far end of the room where the quiet stillness of the house remained unchanged. But now I noticed something I had missed before, the presence of movement beyond the glass, subtle and distant, figures positioned where I would not have seen them unless I was looking for them. My breath caught for just a second, not out of fear but out of realization, because they had always been there, just like before, just like the photograph, just like everything else I had never noticed until now. They are closer than they were, I said, not asking, just acknowledging what I could see, what I could finally understand. He did not deny it. He did not soften it. They are adjusting, he replied, his voice calm. But there was a sharpened edge beneath it now, something more active, more immediate. They know something changed. I felt that settle into me, not as panic, not as uncertainty, but as confirmation, because this was no longer abstract, no longer something I could pretend did not exist. It was real, it was present, and it was moving. I took a slow breath, grounding myself in the moment, in the decision I had already made, and I stepped forward again, closing the distance between us until there was no space left to question what came next. Then we do not give them time to figure it out, I said, the words steady, deliberate, because hesitation did not belong here anymore. His gaze shifted back to mine, locking in with a focus that felt sharper than before. Not colder, not harsher, but more aligned with what was coming. For the first time I saw something else there, not control, not calculation, but recognition, like he was seeing me clearly, not as someone to protect from a distance, but as someone standing beside him in it. He nodded once, small and certain, and then everything moved. Not chaotic. Not rushed. Controlled but faster, more purposeful. A door opened somewhere beyond the room. Footsteps quiet but immediate. The presence of others no longer hidden but still contained. Still disciplined in a way that matched him. Matched this world I had stepped into without realizing it. He did not look at them. He did not need to. Stay with me, he said, and this time it was not a suggestion, not an offer, but something else entirely, something that felt less like control and more like alignment, like two paths choosing to move in the same direction. I did not hesitate. I moved with him. And as we crossed that invisible line between stillness and action, I realized something I could not ignore. I had not been brought here to be hidden. I had been brought here to be prepared. The world outside did not rush to meet us, it waited, quiet and watchful, like it had always been there just beyond the edges of my awareness. And now that I could see it, truly see it, there was no way to pretend it was anything less than real. I stayed close to him as we moved, not because I was told to, but because I understood what distance meant now, what separation could cost, and the space between us felt less like something to guard and more like something to avoid entirely. The hallway stretched ahead, the same polished floors, the same controlled silence, but it no longer felt like a place designed to contain me. It felt like a threshold, something I was crossing with intention instead of being placed within. The doors that had once stayed closed were open now, not wide, not exposed, but enough to show movement, quiet coordination, people who did not need to speak to understand what needed to be done. And for the first time I realized this was not just his world, it was a system, something built long before I ever stepped into it, something that had been moving around me without my knowledge. We did not stop until we reached the far end, where the glass doors separated the controlled stillness inside from the open space beyond, and I hesitated for just a fraction of a second, not out of fear but out of awareness, because stepping through that door was not just movement, it was a decision made real. He did not rush me. He did not pull me forward. He simply stood there, close enough that I could feel his presence, steady enough that I could rely on it, and for a brief moment everything else faded, the movement, the quiet urgency, the world waiting outside, until it was just the line between what I had been and what I was choosing to become. I took a breath, slow and controlled, grounding myself in the certainty that had been building since the moment I stopped reacting and started understanding, and then I stepped forward. The air outside felt different, not colder, not harsher but clearer, like something had shifted in the way I experienced it, like I was no longer moving through it unaware. The distance stretched wider here, the open space removing the illusion of safety that walls provided, and I could feel it immediately, the difference, the exposure, the fact that nothing stood between me and whatever existed beyond this place except what we chose to do next. I did not look around right away. I did not search for the figures I now knew were there. Instead I looked at him. Alexander Volkov stood beside me, unchanged in posture, unchanged in presence, but everything about how I saw him was different, because he was no longer just the man who had taken me from one life into another. He was the man who had seen what I could not, who had stepped in before I even knew I needed him to, who had given me something no one else had. Not safety, not control, a choice. And I had taken it. This is where it changes, I said quietly, not asking, not uncertain, just acknowledging what was already happening, what had already begun. He turned his head slightly, his gaze meeting mine with that same steady intensity, but there was something else there now, something that had not been present before, not hidden, just unspoken until now. It already has, he replied, and the truth of that settled into me with a clarity that felt almost calm, almost certain, because nothing about this felt accidental anymore. I let out a slow breath, my shoulders easing just slightly as everything aligned into something I could finally stand on without hesitation, without doubt. I was not the girl who had been sold in a moment of desperation. I was not the person who had lived unseen, unprotected, unaware. I was something else now, something shaped by truth instead of illusion, by choice instead of circumstance. And as I stood there, no longer hidden, no longer invisible, I understood something that stayed with me long after that moment passed, something simple, something undeniable. He could control the world around him, but the moment I chose to step into it, I changed it too.